Man rescues deer from the mouth of a ferocious bear. What happens next is unbelievable. The desperate bleating cut through the morning silence of the Olympic National Forest like a blade, a sound so raw with terror that wildlife photographer Marcus Chen immediately dropped his camera equipment and turned toward the source of distress. Through the towering Douglas firs, he could see a clearing where a young doe was pinned beneath a large black bear, her white tail flashing frantically as she struggled against the predator's massive weight. The bear's jaws were clamped around her hindquarters, and her high-pitched cries spoke of an animal facing the final moments of a chase that had ended in capture. Marcus's response was instinctive rather than calculated, born from 15 years of documenting wildlife interactions and understanding the delicate balance between intervention and natural process. But this was not a clean predator-prey scenario playing out according to nature's script. The doe's movements suggested she was not weakened by age or injury, and something about the bear's behavior seemed more opportunistic than purposeful. Without conscious decision, Marcus began shouting and clapping his hands while moving rapidly toward the struggle, creating the kind of human disturbance that would typically send any wild bear retreating to safer territory. The black bear's reaction was immediate and exactly what Marcus had hoped for. The large male released his grip on the doe and turned toward this unexpected threat, his dark eyes assessing the situation with the calculating intelligence that had made his species successful survivors in human-encroached habitats. For several tense seconds, the bear stood his ground, weighing the value of his potential meal against the risk posed by the approaching human. Marcus continued his advance, making himself appear as large and threatening as possible, while fighting every instinct that screamed warnings about confronting a predator capable of killing him with a single swipe of those massive claws. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the bear made his choice, turning away from both human and deer to lumber into the dense undergrowth with the unhurried gait of a creature who understood that forests offered plenty of opportunities for those patient enough to wait. Marcus watched until the dark form disappeared completely among the ferns and fallen logs, only then allowing himself to acknowledge the trembling in his hands and the rapid beating of his heart that marked the aftermath of his impulsive decision to intervene in nature's ancient choreography. But when Marcus turned his attention to the rescued doe, her behavior confounded every expectation he had formed about grateful wild animals seeking immediate escape from danger. Instead of bounding away into the safety of the forest, she remained in the clearing, moving in tight, agitated circles while emitting soft bleating calls that seemed directed not at him but toward some distant location beyond the trees. Her large brown eyes darted constantly between Marcus and the forest edge, and her body language spoke of urgent anxiety rather than relief or gratitude. "Easy there, girl," Marcus whispered, studying the doe's movements with growing puzzlement about why she had not fled to safety. The morning mist swirled around her legs as she continued her restless pacing, every gesture suggesting a creature torn between competing instincts in ways that defied Marcus's understanding of normal deer behavior. As Marcus approached the doe with deliberate slowness, he could see the dark stains on her cream-colored hindquarters where the bear's teeth had found purchase during their struggle. The wounds were not life-threatening, but they were bleeding steadily and would need attention if infection was to be avoided in the bacteria-rich environment of the forest floor. The doe allowed his careful approach, her earlier agitation giving way to exhausted acceptance as adrenaline faded and the reality of her injuries began to assert itself through her nervous system. Marcus retrieved his emergency first aid kit from his photography pack, understanding that treating wild animals required a different approach than domestic creatures who had learned to trust human intentions. Every movement had to be telegraphed clearly, every gesture slow and non-threatening as he prepared to clean wounds that could easily become fatal if left untreated in the wilderness. The doe watched his preparations with large, liquid eyes that held wariness but not panic, as if some part of her recognized that this human had already proven himself an ally rather than a threat. The cleaning process required infinite patience as Marcus used bottled water and antiseptic wipes to remove forest debris from puncture wounds that were deeper than they had initially appeared. The doe flinched at each touch but did not attempt to flee, her body trembling with the effort of remaining still while every instinct demanded that she escape from this unnatural contact. Marcus found himself speaking in low, soothing tones, not because he believed the deer understood his words, but because the rhythm of his voice seemed to calm both of them during the careful work of treating injuries that could have been much worse. Once the wounds were cleaned and treated with antibiotic ointment, Marcus applied bandages that would protect the damaged tissue while allowing the doe to move naturally through her forest environment. The process took nearly an hour, during which an extraordinary dynamic developed between human and wild animal. The doe began to show signs of trust that went beyond simple exhaustion, occasionally turning her head to watch Marcus's face rather than his hands, as if reading his intentions in his expressions rather than his actions. But even as her physical condition stabilized and strength returned to her legs, the doe's behavior remained puzzling in ways that spoke to motivations Marcus could not decipher. She would rest for periods, lying in the soft forest duff with her legs folded beneath her, but these moments of calm were punctuated by sudden alertness during which she would lift her head and gaze intensely toward the deeper forest. Her ears would swivel forward, and soft vocalizations would emerge from her throat, not the alarm calls that deer use to warn of danger, but something more like communication directed at someone who was not present. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus realized that the doe's restlessness was not random but focused. She consistently oriented herself toward the same section of forest, and her calls seemed to carry the urgent quality of an animal trying to reach someone important. When she finally struggled to her feet, testing her weight on legs that were steadier than they had been hours earlier, her first movement was not toward escape but toward that mysterious destination that had been calling to her throughout their time together. "Where are you trying to go, girl?" Marcus whispered, watching as she took several careful steps in the direction that had held her attention all afternoon. The doe paused and looked back at him, her expression holding an invitation that transcended the boundaries between their species. The doe's invitation was unmistakable, and Marcus found himself following her deeper into the forest as she moved with increasing urgency despite her bandaged wounds. Her gait was still careful, favoring the injured hindquarters, but there was purpose in every step that spoke to a destination she had been desperate to reach since the morning's ordeal began. She paused frequently to ensure Marcus was following, her large ears swiveling to track his progress through the undergrowth while her eyes remained fixed on the path ahead. The journey led them through increasingly dense vegetation, past fallen logs carpeted with moss and through groves of ancient cedars whose canopy blocked most of the afternoon sunlight. The doe navigated this terrain with the confidence of an animal intimately familiar with every root and branch, but her route seemed deliberately circuitous, taking them around clearings and open spaces that would have offered easier passage. Marcus began to understand that this was not simply a path to safety, but a carefully planned approach to something precious that required protection from observation. The thicket she finally approached was nearly impenetrable, a tangle of salmonberry and vine maple that formed a natural fortress in a small depression between two massive Douglas firs. The doe's behavior changed completely as they neared the sanctuary, her movements becoming both more cautious and more urgent as soft vocalizations emerged from her throat. These were not the bleating calls of distress Marcus had heard earlier, but something entirely different, gentle, reassuring sounds that carried the unmistakable cadence of maternal communication. The answer to the day's mystery came in the form of a movement so small Marcus almost missed it, the twitch of an oversized ear deep within the protective brambles. Then he saw the fawn, perfectly camouflaged among the dappled shadows, its spotted coat invisible until movement revealed the tiny form curled in the exact center of the thicket's protection. The newborn could not have been more than a few days old, still bearing the wobbly proportions and uncertain movements of a creature newly arrived in a dangerous world. The reunion was immediate and profound, the doe pushing through the thorny barrier to reach her offspring while continuing the soft rumbling vocalizations that seemed to reassure the fawn that the long separation was finally over. Marcus understood then what he had witnessed throughout the entire day, not the rescue of a random deer, but the culmination of a mother's desperate strategy to draw a predator away from her most vulnerable treasure. "You led him away from your baby," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with recognition of the sacrifice he had witnessed. The evening light filtered through the cedar canopy as mother and fawn pressed close together in their bramble sanctuary, two hearts reunited by a love that had risked everything and asked for nothing in return.